This is a non-exhaustive list of some of the major works in this field, starting in 1985 with By the Bomb's Early Light by Paul Boyer, who looked at a wide range of media that was related to nuclear themes and found a couple of things. One, that nuclear themes immediately after World War II saturated American culture across the board. And two, surprisingly, that this was something that was relatively untouched by scholarship. So this is something he took up in 1985 and then quickly was followed by several other scholars, and over time became mostly focused on cinema for reasons that may become apparent as I discuss this. Paul Boyer said, if a scholar 1,000 years from now had no evidence about what had happened in the United States between 1945 and 1985, except books produced by the cultural and intellectual historians of that era, he or she would hardly guess that such a thing as nuclear weapons had existed. We have somehow managed to avert our attention from the pervasive impact of the bomb on this dimension of our collective experience. And there's a few themes here that will come up over and over. One being the collective experience, the psychological reaction to the bomb, which again was something that hadn't been investigated before this time. And as I mentioned, the fact that it nevertheless saturates a lot of Cold War and postmodern culture. I'm going to show three quotes, different quotes from different scholars to give you the idea of the kind of commonalities that these researchers were discovering as they analyzed these media, as again I said, especially film. This is from Spencer Wirt, who wrote Nuclear Fear in 1988, and this was a paper that was updating his findings in 2007. He said it was already clear 20 years ago that this is an extraordinarily powerful complex of images, perhaps the most powerful ever described. Countless nuclear images are linked together through an ancient theme, what I called the theme of transmutation. This embodies universal myths of world apocalypse, played out on an external and global stage, and correspondingly on an internal and individual stage. The universal theme of personal renewal. The mushroom cloud, the mandala-like symbol of the atom, the pictures of devastated.
It's not working. Oh, will you share your screen because we can't see any of your quotes or anything?
Okay, yeah, please share. I'm sorry about that.
That's okay. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay, so he says, the mushroom cloud, the mandala-like symbol of the atom, the pictures of a devastated and unpeopled city, the promises of marvelous atomic-powered airplanes, all these images and many more have strong historical and contemporary connections with themes of magical transformation, and versions of all of these are still to be seen in contemporary culture. Let's see, again, this got out of order. Another scholar, Robert Jacobs. Since the introduction of the bomb to the American public in 1945, there has been a primary nuclear narrative in which the bomb functions as a signifier of social transformation. This narrative emerged from the rhetoric that explained the bomb in 1945 and 46. I call this narrative of nuclear culture the alchemical narrative. Alchemical because of its strong emphasis on nuclear weapons as signifiers of transformation and fundamental change. This alchemical narrative told a fundamental story about the atomic age. It was a turning point for human society. It was an age of transformation. To people around the world, nuclear weapons announced that the past was gone and the future had arrived. The third scholar, looking at the same subject matter, says, shadows of life and death capture the imagination. The bomb is not simply a category of being. It is a very real, tangible thing. However, through atomic bomb cinema and other modes of communication, it has worked its way into human consciousness as an emblem of the apocalyptic imagination. In this sense, as a product of modern physics, it has transcended even its own physical threat and found its place with the most ancient symbols and most primal forms of reconciliation with life itself. So I'm not sure how illuminating those quotes are, except in a broad sense, in terms of these scholars' conclusions regarding nuclear culture and nuclear narratives, especially within film. But they all have found that there are these consistent patterns that have to do with alchemical transformation of both the individual and of society. So much so that Spencer Wirt declared nuclear energy a new arcanum, a modern arcanum that has replaced the Philosopher's Stone as this central symbol surrounded by many other symbols that have to do with transformation. Basically, these nuclear narratives boil down to three essential components. One, that individual and social alchemical transformation. They tend to be apocalyptic in the traditional sense. And their plot lines and metaphors are inspired by actual events in the timeline of nuclear history. So as I said, we'll look at some actual examples, two of which have already been analyzed in scholarship, Godzilla and the Atomic Kid. And then I'll look at three that I'll analyze for you, Back to the Future, Dark, and V for Vendetta. Godzilla is a common example, one, because it's a Japanese film from 1954, and incorporates themes of radioactivity in its plot line. Godzilla, the giant sea lizard, is disturbed in the ocean due to hydrogen testing in the Pacific by the United States and is unleashed on Japan. This image in the middle is the actual test of the Castle Bravo shot, it's called. And this entered the public awareness because the fallout was so extreme, it exceeded what the scientists expected, and it actually affected this fishing vessel on the right called the Lucky Dragon. The crew was subject to radioactive sickness or radiation sickness, and one of them died. And so, and Ishiro Honda, the director of Godzilla, incorporated specific elements into the film that had to do with that incident and also with hydrogen bomb testing in general in the Pacific. And so what we're seeing here is an attempt to deal with actual traumatic events using metaphor and fantastic elements within film for a population. Fast forward, oops, again, this got out of order. Actually, the same year, 1954, an American production, The Atomic Kid, incorporated elements from an actual atomic bomb test known as Upshot Knothole Annie, and along with that, an operation called Operation Doorstep that looked at the impact of the bomb on homes, automobiles, and mannequins. And they invited news stations. There were newsreel cameras there, television cameras, and it was broadcast across the nation. The next year, it was put into this fictional narrative by Hollywood. As you can see there in the poster, there's a home and a nuclear explosion. Mickey Rooney, who stars in it, miraculously survives the bomb blast and is imbued with power, superhuman power, that the US government then uses to break up a spy ring. Those are the two examples that have already been looked at by scholarship. Back to the Future has not been, for some interesting reasons, but for those that are familiar with Back to the Future, you may be surprised to find out that it's based on the Browns Ferry nuclear power plant in Athens, Alabama in the US. It was the largest nuclear power plant at the time and the first to exceed 1 gigawatt of electricity output. If you remember, Doc Brown screams at one point 1.21 gigawatts. That's a reference to this fact. Also, here in the bottom center, that's the actual courthouse in Limestone, Alabama, which is the county seat of Athens, Alabama, where the power plant is located and served as the basis of the courthouse in Back to the Future on the bottom right. If you can, it's hard to see, but on the top right, you've got the point where Marty time travels back to the future. It's right at a theater that's playing none other than the Atomic Kid. And there's several other direct allusions to the Atomic Kid in Back to the Future. And so Robert Zemeckis, the director, is referring back to the use of these kind of themes, including actual nuclear events in the Atomic Kid in his own production. Dark by Netflix, a German production. The creators of Dark have acknowledged that it was inspired by the Fukushima nuclear power plant disaster in 2011. On the top right, you have a literal nuclear power plant, but in a fictional town of Winden, which serves as the setting for Dark. And bottom right, the actual disaster of Fukushima, which interestingly enough also inspired German politicians to commit to phase out nuclear energy in Germany by 2022 in actuality. And similar to how Back to the Future has several direct references to the Atomic Kid, there are several direct references to Back to the Future in Dark, both in the dialogue, in the in elements of the narrative, and for instance, the time traveling portal in this cave system underneath the nuclear power plant resembles the flux capacitor from the time traveling DeLorean in Back to the Future, the triple crossroads essentially. So now, as far as conclusions, a lot of these scholars, the question is, why are we seeing this? On the one hand, in my opinion, we have a deliberate effort of these creators to perpetuate the same sort of template, this nuclear narrative that incorporates actual events, weaves in alchemical transmutative themes, and often gives it an apocalyptic structure. But there's also something psychological going on, at least that's what many of these scholars have concluded, which is that they appeal to depth psychology in order to understand what is happening on a collective level. Similar to how our dreams can act as a gateway into our repressed traumas on an individual level in psychoanalysis. Historians of nuclear narratives, I argue, have opened up a new avenue into understanding our collective traumas, and that film and other forms of visual media can be analyzed in order to understand how populations grapple with these actual events. This is a quote from Yuki Tanaka, a Japanese scholar, regarding Godzilla. He says, "It must be remembered that many Japanese people who saw the original Godzilla film had firsthand experience of aerial bombing and had lost relatives and friends as a result. These horrible pictures could be seen as reproductions of what actually happened in cities throughout Japan in napalm attacks. The film clearly reflects the deep scars of war on Japanese society. Yet Godzilla allowed Japanese to heal their pain through watching an entertaining film, which at the same time indirectly reflected tormenting wartime experiences." Spencer Wirt has analyzed this probably more than anyone else and has brought up that in the 1980s, there was a shift in neuropsychology away from what's called associationism, that basically is a theory that our mental processes are associated with each other through just a succession of mental states, and that through repetition, sort of in a Pavlovian sense, we make associations between mental states and symbols and images and whatnot. We now incorporate much more of an emotional element to understand how trauma works. And this, for one thing, he says that this perspective sheds light on the fact that it's not just a matter of repetition, but rather a single event can have such a traumatic, it can leave an indelible association between an event, symbols, patterns, and images. And that's the suggestion is that that's what we're seeing in cinema. We are particularly responsive to fear and disgust, and that can kind of be wrapped up in this concept of contamination. And so we've seen in the post-Cold War era this
Hello,
interesting.
Eric?
Yes.
Are you able to hear me? Yes. Sorry to come in like this, but you've gone past 15 minutes, so please start wrapping up if you can.
Okay, will do. So what we've seen now is what is called a reassignment or realignment of symbols. And a very clear example of this is V for Vendetta, in which the graphic novel took place in a nuclear dystopic or dystopian setting and was replaced in the 2005 film with the pandemic setting. And so we're seeing, my suggestion is that this nuclear narrative template, which is both universal and very defined, is now being used to process things like artificial intelligence threats, pandemics, alien invasion, and so on. I will bring this part up if a question relates to it, but otherwise that is the end.